This is IBM Museum. I did have some new diskettes come in today. I was going to make some more reference and starter diskettes for the PS2 systems I'm going to be troubleshooting in video, including on a Model 3286. I want to work with the diskette image and see if it may actually require a 720 KB diskette in the condition that the system gets into. And this is the 8086 based Model 30. I've shown this before. And it's funny that this is the kind of the go-to system that I'm doing for making the starter and reference diskettes. The video I did on making the starter diskette was from the system. And normally this has a 720 KB diskette drive, but I've gone through and changed that out years ago for the 1.44 megabyte drive. It's an easy swap in. You don't even have to change the configuration. The system just goes with it and understands that you've changed the diskette drive out for a higher capacity unit. And I do have the 360 KB external drive, and this is called the 4869-001 drive for being 360 KB. The 1.2 megabyte version is the 4869-002. And then I've got my SCSI CD-ROM drive on the top here, and that's what helps me make it this system for generating those diskettes is I'm able to easily transfer over from an inexpensive CDR now to be able to read the file and copy it over to the 1 gigabyte SCSI hard drive that I have on the system as well. So I can have all those images and basically the ability in the diskette drives to be able to create the diskettes that I need. And so it works out to be a good system. But I thought for this, before I get started in going through and making starter and reference diskettes again, and I'll have a demonstration of the GoTech stuff for the solid state replacement of floppy drives to replace those aging and broken floppy diskette drives on the PS2s, the non-functional diskette drives. But for this video, I kind of wanted to show it. I've only seem to be the only one that's ever heard this, and I talk about it on the comp.sys.ps2.hardware news group, and no one else seems to have encountered that. And this is, as it shows in the image in the upper right-hand corner here, the IBM Personal System 2 System Information Utility is what it says on the label on the diskette. And this is version 1.10. And internally, this is actually identified as a System Information Tool, SIT. And I'm going through in my Visual Basic for DOS and basically creating an enhancement for this or a more modern program that goes through. And you'll see on the Model 30 some of the things that we encounter where it doesn't give a whole bunch of information on this system with the upgrades I've done in some cases, or just limitations of the program. And probably later I'll compare it to how it stacks against the Microsoft Diagnostic, which is the most comparable program. And that was included with, I think that started with like MS-DOS 5 and went into the DOS 6.2 and 6.22 that I have on this Model 30. So we'll run through kind of what the System Information Tool displays on the system And later, when I have a little bit more functional of program of what I'm going to use to replace this, I'll go through and cover that as well. And so the diskette is non-functional for me. It's just been exposed to too much magnetic stuff, or I've just used it too much. But thankfully over the years, I've copied it onto enough systems, and in this case, I'll be running it from the hard drive of the PS2 Model 30 here. And so before we start it, let's take a look at the size of the program. And I mean, I could basically put this back on a functional diskette with this, or even put it on a low density diskette. Even I doubt if it'd work very well on any of the PC series or earlier machines to show that information. And certainly the Visual Basic for DOS program that I'm going to come up with, I'll probably go back a little bit further than PS2s and have it give information on the PC series and some of the things like that. It does that initial animation. And here it's also, I guess, identified as System Information Utility. But you saw me type SIT to start it, the tool. And then within this, it's identified here as the System Information Tool. And I haven't looked at the help. I don't even know if that is context-sensitive help in this regard before. And I think this program does have mouse support, although it just shows a block cursor. And on my PS2 Model 30, I've got it to where when I get into Windows 3.0, I have mouse from the mouse driver that's there, but I don't have a DOS mouse driver on that system. I've never encountered the need for the use of a mouse, although I'll probably put one on there just for using edit in the quick basic that is in the MS-DOS on that machine. Let's check the F1 just to see what it... Okay, item help, window help, using help. Let's look through. Okay. And we do escape to go back to the prior screen. So we're going to step through all these items. Window help. And it does have the scroll bars over on along the right edge and lower edge, just like we're used to with Windows now. And I can use the scroll keys at least here. And that's where that mouse driver would come in handy. And in that upper left-hand corner, we have the close box, basically, that closes the window like we're all used to as well. Using help. Okay, and here again, identifying as a System Information Tool. And that's what I've always known it as. Oh, there talks about the mouse buttons. So, and I definitely do remember using the mouse. We'll also see the System Information Tool. I plan on doing it on a little bit more high-end systems later on for the PS2 series, just because the wealth of information. That's what it's actually designed for. The microchannel systems of the PS2 line, of course, being the more common notion of what people think when they hear PS2. Even though the Model 30 is an 8-bit, or what's called the XT bus in this case, or the Model 30 286, Model 25 286, and even later systems like the Model 35 and 40, and that might be even interesting to run it on that as well. And here at the bottom, they talk about utility again. I guess it's a tool or utility. So we've been through all the help information, and the first item here, and this looks roughly in alphabetical order. It's not sorted through any other way, kind of like MSD does for, or Microsoft Diagnostic does for having the more prominent items that you check first. And right away we hit on this, and of course the adapters and being the enumerated slots in microchannel, the system being able to check those microchannel slots to find out what adapters are in there. And we're going to see what they really use for that, because really there's a wide variety of microchannel adapters out there. And this may actually just identify the what's called the POS ID, or the adapter ID, like I talked about before, and being helpful to find the right ADF out there for the adapter that you have in the system, going to that repository that Peter went or others have online and being able to find that ADF image to put on your reference diskette and be able to configure the system. So we'll see what that does when we get and test on a microchannel system. Disk information. Okay, hard drives by okay, and I'm going to go through the okay, what does this say for specified logical drive? So you can get a little bit of information on these as you go through. So hard disk by drive letter, and of course I have only the one drive, and it's a gigabyte in size that's showing here. And there's submenus in these as well, and we'll just go in there, and then I'm backing out by pressing the escape key. This is where we don't have any child windows from here. It's just gone through and it's identifying its okay, showing the partitions that I have. Oh, and I could even get some information on this. It giving quite a bit of information there. The OEM name, MS-DOS 5, even though I've got newer versions of MS-DOS on there. That may have been something that way back in the day. And it's interesting enough that 1 gigabyte hard drive that's in there is an IBM brand, but then it has a compact label on it and was likely used for a compact server of some form. And these are grayed out, so it doesn't give me anything about the unallocated space. Okay, backing out. Diskette drives. Okay, so we have our drive A, and that's that 1.44 megabyte diskette drive that I've put on there. And then we have our external 4869. And the delay, I went through, and to prep for this video, I went through this earlier. And there's just a delay in here. It actually has the drive access light on behind me as it tries to go through and read that drive to determine what it is. And it identifies it correctly in this case. And of course, there's not any diskette in the drive. And the 4869 drives are kind of interesting to hear sometimes, since they're an external drive. You have a diskette in there, and you can actually hear a clunk as it goes through, and when you go through to read the diskette or write to the diskette, it clunks the drives in place, and the very mechanical nature of that drive. Okay. And so that's all of the disk information, keyboard information. And in this case, it just tells us that the 101/102 keyboard supported. And later on with some of the microchannel systems, there is what's called a host connect keyboard that's supported, the 122 key keyboards. And we'll run this on a system that has that 122 key keyboard support later on. Memory information, memory hardware. Okay, and then this system is not supported. Again, we'll get into, and the Model 30 8086 based version, as well as the 286 version, has just the 30-pin SIMs, and that doesn't really provide a lot of information to the system. I mean, they can be 256 KB SIMs, or really in rare instances, the 1 megabyte SIMs, 30-pin SIMs that work on the Model 25 286, Model 30 286, since those systems share a planar, and it can also be used on, I think there's some other memory adapters that it can be used on, and then on the microchannel SCSI adapter, this caching SCSI adapter called the Spock. Those, it can use also those modules to go through and beef up the cache memory on the Spock. I'll be showing the Spocks later on. The video I went through earlier on showing the SCSI cards I got from Japan, from Sunny, the pseudonym Sunny, or I mean Sandy. I went through, and some of those had cache, but that's soldered onto the cards themselves, so not a replaceable SIM. You can't upgrade it. So we hit on the first thing that's not supported on the system, and then there's some information just on the system memory there. I don't think I have any sub-windows. Memory mapping. And then again, we have the scroll on the right-hand side. And memory map under 16 megabytes. So you can see that as we go down, and this being an 8086 based system, although it's got the V30 8 megahertz CPU that I've put in there as an upgrade, it only recognize you know you can have that regular system memory of up to a megabyte and RAM, and some of the expanded memory boards, we're not really going to get into those. It's not really a common thing even for that that level of system. Miscellaneous technical information. So, and this is the system feature bytes information. It gives some, there's an interrupt call that's interrupt 15 function C0 called get configuration. And I've gone over that a little bit recently on some of the Facebook groups and things like that, on what that BIOS interrupt call basically provides information, and can tell if the system is a microchannel or non-microchannel bus, ISA, or what they call the AT bus. And it's even interesting on the Model 30 that it identifies that the real-time clock is present. I wonder what that would show on another development on the Model 25, because the Model 25 8086 base version is the only system without a real-time clock on it in normal circumstances, or on the planar system planar. And external event, extended BIOS data area is allocated. That came in, I think, with PS2s as well. System has an AT bus. DMA supports 24-bit address space. I'm just reading through these. You can read through them as well. 8042 keyboard controller and system. That's relating to the host connect keyboard and things like that. We'll see systems that change that keyboard controller. Data streaming is unsupported. That's in some of the higher end PS2s. SCSI subsystem is not present on the system board. That's also something in higher end PS2s as well. Information panel is not installed. We'll probably get into the, I don't know how far out, that'll be a video on the information panel. And that was typically the Model 95s, which are treated as being the ultimate end on the PS2 line. And that also goes over to the PC Server 500 because it has the same planar in it as the Model 95s, and that information panel can be it's on the front of the system at the top, and it can be either on the right or the left depending on the particular version of the Model 95, whether it's an 8595 or 9595. And I've also likely have the only Model 85, which looks a lot like the Model 95 externally, but it doesn't have that info panel. And I actually have what they call the Model 85X version that has all the driver circuitry for that information panel. So I have likely the only Model 85X anywhere that has an information panel in it. I switched in the information panel since I'm able to run it from that system. And this is not an IML system, initial machine load, and we'll see how that comes into play later on with the higher end PS2s as well, where you actually have that reference diskette functionality or over on the hard drive of the system. There's a special partition that is used to go through and be able to configure the system rather than having running that reference diskette from the floppy drive, and which can be handy if the floppy drive has failed. So we'll likely get into that on the higher end PS2s to kind of show what IML means in that case, or that running that reference diskette functionality from the hard drive. And then SCSI support, not in the IML image. And if IML is always, it's SCSI based. And so that's just those corresponding details about that IML and SCSI subsystem on the PS2. So let's go through mouse information. And even though I do have a mouse on there, I don't have a DOS driver loaded. If I were to have that, it would, of course, show that it's present. Operating system information. Operating system is MS-DOS version 6.22. Model and processor information. This is probably the most helpful area to me. And as we see again for this Model 30, it just doesn't understand what machine what system it is of the PS2 line with that NEC V30 CPU in there. It just doesn't know how to identify that at all. And I'd have to see if this is able to identify the 8086 CPU and 286 CPUs and things like that. I do have a coprocessor in there, an 8087, but again, it's saying unknown. For the model, we get very similar information as the Microsoft Diagnostic or MSD would give, with the model And the 8086 based Mul 25 and Mul 30 are the only ones that are a BIOS, a Mul identifier of FA for having that 8086 CPU. And 286 and 386 levels, and the other earlier PC line with the 8088, the PC convertible that I've shown in videos, that's a bit unique as well. It's the only Mul that has its own model, even though it's an 8088 CPU. It's actually an 80C for CMOS 88 static CPU that's in the little PLC package that's surface mounted to the system board. But since it's different from that 40-pin DIP type that's on the PC series, they gave it a different model number. So the model of the machine is typically related to the CPU. Although when IBM got into the 386 and above, including the 386SX, from there they had the Mul identifiers F8 for all the, if it was a 386 or a SX or above, 386DX, 46SX, 46DX, even into the Pentium lines, still identifies as F8. And then submodel, so that's the system with within that main model identifier. And there's charts on this stuff that are around, but basically the submodel 00 is the Model 30, and 01 is the Mul 25. There's only the two submodels in that series of the FA model. And in some cases, IBM modifies this for which version of the planar that you have. I'm looking at whether that would maybe report a different submodel if you have the Type 1 Mul 25 or the Type 2 Mul 25. But on the higher level PS2s, they went through and they tried to have a convention to where in some cases the BIOS on that system would report what planar version that is, differently from the other PS2, the same model of PS2s, just so in software they could determine what version of the planar had. And then the BIOS revision, and I was laughing about once I eventually saw this again, that I was looking around for this 12/12 1986 BIOS, and I was asking around if anybody else had it because I wanted to image it with the other Mul 30 BIOSes I had. And I had even a spare set of chips that had the latest Mul 30 BIOS. I said, I'll ship them to you. You can put them in, and you just, as long as you send me that version. And I found it was right under my nose all the time. And that version, that's the 12 or December 12th of 1986, and this is in this date is in US format, and prior to Y2K as well. You can kind of see where they're just using the 2-digit year identification in that case, but it's we'll see that later on as in BIOS. Since that was always US based from IBM, they always listed the month first and the date second. But that can be a little bit confusing when you look at the European side where they changed it around. And of course, we agree the best convention, or the military convention that I learned to use, was the day spelling out the first 3 letters of the month, and then writing the year as a full 4-digit number. And then on this screen, we see at the very end, the system board pause ID, and it's just identifying as FFFF, similar to what we saw about the on the ADF video, that if it's not able to, if there's not an adapter in the slot, or just in hierarchy, rather than going through and saying 0, it uses FFFF basically as an I don't know, or that's not supported on the system. And the pause ID will come into play with the microchannel planars on PS2s, and very similar to the ADFs having a pause ID for those adapters, and being able to find the right adapter support. The planar ID, and I'll have some video content on those as well later on, and how to get the planar ID and the planar ID that various systems can have. I'll cover that, and that's just a way to distinguish the system, which PS2 model it is, and there are some duplicates in there, but there's ways that I'll go through and show how to separate those, so you know, would even code without knowing what machine it runs on, is able to identify it down to a particular PS2 model, and even in a lot of instances a submodel or the planar version once again, because there are systems, PS2 systems, that had a different planar ID for those type 1, type 2, type 3 planars. And so we'll see the system information tool run on a microchannel system eventually. I'll run it on that. Okay, parallel port and serial port information. When I looked over this earlier, it was kind of interesting. I guess I remember it from Microsoft Diagnostic. I also ran that tonight. I'll have a video. Well, I'll do the same thing and run through that, because the system information tool is the closest parallel of SIT is to the Microsoft Diagnostic, or MSD. It was included with the later versions of DOS. And MSD, in this case, you'll see it on video, it was actually saying that I had 3 parallel ports on the system, and I don't know what it was identifying, what other maybe something to the SCSI adapter I have in there, or something else is throwing it, and it was just showing 0 values for those other 2 parallel ports. But in this instance, this system information tool doesn't identify any detail to the parallel or serial ports, which is kind of interesting, because on a PS2, the parallel ports that was the first bidirectional parallel ports that came in, and every PS2 supports a bidirectional port. Later on, the industry, just like the keyboard and mouse attachments, they referred to that as a PS2 parallel port, because it was bidirectional, or that mode. And there was a later mode of the higher level transfers that came in that were or an upgrade of the parallel ports, or added more functionality beyond the bidirectional. I think it was I think they called it ECP mode or something like that. But SIT doesn't identify whether the parallel port is unidirectional or bidirectional. And then even in the cases of the serial ports on the Model 30, it has, excuse me, on the Model 30, it's just an 8250 chip that doesn't have a 5.0 buffer, and on the microchannel systems, those all have a 5.0 buffer for the UART chips, what's called the UART chips. And the Microsoft Diagnostic goes through and does that, identifies the serial ports, the chips that are in there and used based on that functionality, but the system information tool does not in this case. That may be something handy that I can include in that Visual Basic for DOS program when I write it. And I'm not going to go in this instance into the SCSI information because that locks up the system, as I went through and prepped earlier for this video. And it may be where the SCSI adapter I have in there, the Trantor T130B that I have in the Model 30 may just hook into the system calls or tell the system it's SCSI, but then when IBM goes through and wants to identify it, basically a SCSI subsystem of their making, that causes a conflict there. And so we'll go into that with the higher level PS2s, and the information there is quite handy. I don't think it gives the SCSI microcode versions, which I've done a separate program. I found a separate program by IBM and expanded that and made it cover more models. And there will be no doubt that I'll cover that SCSI level program. And IBM just had to stick to that 8.3 DOS convention. So they spelled it as SCSILEVL, since they didn't have the ability to put in that extra E in there. With that being 9 characters, they had to have the file name 8 characters or less. Let's get into the video information, and this might be kind of handy on the higher end PS2s as well. I'm not using the MCGA video in this case of the Model 30. The Model 25 and Model 30 that were based on the 8086 CPU had that MCGA video, and certainly there's been related videos that I'm aware of and about that MCGA. The one video I did of the common issue that I'm starting to see on Model 30s and Model 25s about the power on, where you don't have any video. And remember, Dave Murray, the 8-bit guy, went to those executive workstations and didn't get any initial video. And that was just because the MCGA controller is very power sensitive. And as it goes through, and that's what happens if there's apparently too much current draw on the system or load on the system, it affects that MCGA controller, and it has to basically warm up a little bit to be able to display video. And on that earlier video of the trouble I encountered, I went through and when I did a warm boot from there, that caused the system to recover and have video displayed. And that seems to be, if you have even a system with the basic components and that 90-watt power supply that comes with the Model 30 being rather low powered, but it's sufficient for the system and throughout all these years. But if you have a connection into that MCGA video on the planar, that's sensitive power. And I used another Model 30 for that video that had just the basic components. And in this case, with the Model 30 that I have here, it's actually so overloaded. I call it the Max 30 because it just has every little thing on there with all those adapters for the SCSI hard drive, which certainly has a power draw. The external diskette drive, even though the drive externally is powered up, it has its own power supply in there. But having those multiple adapters in there, I have a floating point coprocessor in there, as I said, 8087. And I have the system the electrical use, I mean, I'm really getting the VGA adapter being primary to that. There's a lot more power draw from this Max 30 than I had with that other Model 30 system. But I have the VGA adapter in there, and that VGA adapter is not sensitive to the power load even with all the other demands on the PSU for the system, like the MCGA video controller that's on the planer is for having basic things on the planer, or a basically configured system, and nothing more than what the system came from the factory. And it's just those the power supplies are getting a little bit weaker, and it's showing over time that those that MCGA video is just failing on that when you flip the switch. And to Dave Murray, I mean, I don't want to get any attacks from fanboys. He's done a lot of things with the Commodore systems, and he's covered those older systems in an excellent way throughout the years, and he just wasn't aware of that issue. And also the executive workstation, which was probably a prototype of the Model 25, since it had that integrated display, had the earlier Model 30 planer in there, all the other Model 30 components, and then had the display on top of it, was probably a prototype for the Model 25 system that came along later. And in particular, the Model 25, when it was introduced after the Model 30, had the same features and only lacked that real-time clock that ironically that prototype had. But those executive workstations, just like the Model 25s, and that's why this problem is also very apparent on them, has a smaller PSU. The executive workstation has that smaller PSU. That's undoubtedly why he encountered that error when he went to go through and start those systems. So we've gone through, that's the last item, and it's just showing the basic VGA details there. And that'll be more interesting information on the higher end PS2s and some of their video things that they can, adapters they can have, or video on the planer. And it'll be interesting to test that on a higher level system. So we're going to go through, we'll do an escape to get out of sit back to the command line. And that's all I have for this video. If you like it, please click on that like button. Please subscribe to my channel. This was a certainly extended video, and I'll have to see how long it takes for me to render it tonight, but I'll get it up. And subscribe to my channel if you like the content. This is good, wide variety of content that I'm going to have that I'll be bringing to this. That's all I have. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.